The high school hallway was always a kind of controlled chaos, a river of noise and motion that Leo had learned to navigate like a ghost. It was a familiar symphony of sounds, the sharp slam of locker doors echoing off the polished linoleum floors, the high-pitched squeak of sneakers making a sudden turn, and the constant, overlapping hum of 100 different conversations all happening at once. There was the smell of floor wax and teenage perfume, a scent so common he barely noticed it anymore. Leo moved through it all with a practiced ease, his shoulders slightly hunched, his eyes fixed on some point just ahead of him, never quite making contact with anyone else's gaze. He wasn't scared or sad, not really. He was just quiet. His world was a rich, internal one, filled with the intricate lines of his sketchbook and the private soundtracks that streamed from his headphones, acting as a shield against the outside world's noise. People knew who he was. In the way you know a painting on the wall you pass every day. You see it, you recognize it, but you never really look at it. He was Leo, the quiet kid. He sat in the back of every class, his head often bent over a notebook where fantastical creatures and sprawling cities took form instead of algebraic equations. He didn't raise his hand, he didn't join clubs, and he didn't go to the loud, crowded football games on Friday nights. He just existed on the periphery. A silent observer. At the center of this social universe, of course, were people like Blake. Blake and his friends were like suns, and everyone else were planets orbiting around them, desperate for their warmth and attention. They moved through the hallway with an easy, unshakable confidence, their laughter booming and drawing eyes. People parted for them instinctively, a sea of students splitting to let the popular crew pass by. Leo had learned to time his movements to avoid these currents, to slip along the walls where the water was calmer. He had once been close enough to hear Blake talking about a party, his voice loud and full of certainty, and he had felt the sheer force of his personality, a power Leo had no interest in possessing. It was a different world, and Leo was content to be a tourist, not a resident. One Tuesday, something strange happened. It was a small thing, a ripple in the normal flow of the day. Near the main office, a large cork bulletin board was usually a mess of forgotten flyers and outdated announcements. But today, a single, bright yellow piece of paper dominated the space, the sign-up sheet for the annual talent show. It was a major event, the one time of year when the school's social hierarchy could be challenged, if only for a night. Already, the sheet was filling up. At the top, in big confident letters, was Blake and the Voltage, the name of Blake's band. Below it were other familiar names, the head cheerleader, who was doing a solo dance, a class clown who promised a comedy routine, and a pair of twins who were a known singing duo. These were the expected names. The usual suspects. Leo saw the crowd gathered around the board, but, as usual, kept his distance. He was just passing by on his way to the library when a voice cut through the general murmur. "Wait a minute. Look at this." The voice was laced with pure confusion. A few kids leaned in closer. Another one let out a short, sharp laugh. "No way," someone whispered. The whisper spread, and the small crowd around the board grew, a knot of curiosity tightening in the middle of the hallway. Leo slowed his steps, his curiosity piqued despite himself. He watched from a distance as a girl with bright red hair pointed at the sheet, her finger tracing a line near the bottom. "It just says Leo," she said, her voice loud enough for Leo to catch. "Just Leo." A moment of silence, and then the murmurs erupted like a hive of bees. "Leo? Which Leo? You don't think that Leo, do you?" The question hung in the air. Of course it was that Leo, there was no other. The idea was so absurd it was almost funny. The quiet kid, the ghost, the boy who never said a word, was signing up for the talent show? What could he possibly do? The joke started quietly at first. Maybe he's going to do a dramatic reading of the school's lunch menu, or a performance art piece about napping. I bet his talent is standing really still for a long time. A few snickers escaped, and the sound was like a tiny stone skipping across the surface of Leo's calm. He saw Blake push his way through the small crowd to see what the fuss was about. Blake scanned the list, his eyes skipping over the big names until they landed on the single, simple signature at the bottom. A smirk played on his lips. He didn't say anything, just shook his head slightly and turned away, but the gesture was enough. It was a look of pure, dismissive amusement, and it gave everyone else permission to find it hilarious too. The laughter grew a little louder, a little more open. Leo stood there for a moment, the hood of his gray sweatshirt pulled low over his forehead. He could feel their eyes on him now, a dozen or more glances that flickered between the sign-up sheet and him. He was no longer a ghost. He was an anomaly, a puzzle they couldn't solve and a joke they didn't understand. A strange feeling bubbled up inside him. It wasn't embarrassment or anger. It was something else, something quiet and solid. He felt a small, almost invisible smile touch his lips as he watched them try to figure him out. They saw the quiet kid, the empty shell. They had no idea about the world that lived inside his head, the sounds and rhythms he practiced when no one was listening. He let their laughter wash over him, a meaningless noise in the grand scheme of things. He had his own plan, his own music, and for the first time, he was going to let them hear it. Without another look at the crowd, he turned, pulled the strings of his hoodie tighter, and continued down the hall toward the library, leaving the buzzing confusion behind him. The mystery was set, and the stage was waiting. The night of the talent show arrived, and the school auditorium felt like a different world entirely. The usually dusty, quiet space was alive with a crackling energy. The air, thick with the scent of popcorn from the lobby and the hallway and the faint, sweet smell of hairspray, buzzed with 1,000 excited conversations. Parents fanned themselves with the event programs, while younger siblings squirmed in their seats, already bored. The heavy velvet curtains on stage, a deep, worn red, were pulled tight, hiding the world of polished wood and bright lights that awaited the performers. Every so often, a sliver of light would escape from the side, hinting at the activity backstage. The whole room was a container of anticipation, a pressure cooker of hopes and nerves. And Leo could feel it all the way from his hidden spot in the wings. He had been there for an hour, watching the other acts prepare. He saw the cheerleading squad stretch in perfect unison, their whispered commands sharp and precise. He saw the comedy duo nervously rehearsing their lines, their laughter a little too loud, a little too forced. And he saw Blake and his band, the Voltage, gathered in a circle, their confidence radiating off them like heat. Blake was tuning his electric guitar, his movements fluid and sure. He didn't look nervous at all. He looked like he owned the place, and in a way he did. He was the king of this school, and the stage was just another part of his kingdom. Leo watched them, feeling a strange sense of calm. He was an outsider here, a ghost in the machine, and that was okay. He wasn't here to play their game. The show began. The lights dimmed, and the principal walked out to a smattering of polite applause. After a few welcoming words, the first act was introduced. The performances were a predictable mix of enthusiasm and mediocrity. There was a piano piece that was technically perfect but lacked any soul, a dance routine that was slightly out of sync, and the comedy duo whose jokes landed with a thud more often than not. The crowd was polite, but the real energy in the room was waiting for one thing: Blake's band, when the principal announced, "And now, please give a huge welcome for the Voltage." The auditorium erupted. A roar came from the section filled with their friends, and the rest of the crowd applauded, caught up in the excitement. Blake and his band strode onto the stage like rock stars. Blake grabbed the microphone, a smirk on his face. "How we doing tonight?" he yelled, and the crowd screamed back. They launched into their song, a loud, driving cover of a classic rock anthem. It was all noise and energy. Blake's vocals were passable but a bit flat, and the guitarist missed a couple of notes, but it didn't matter. They were moving, jumping around the stage, feeding off the adoration of their peers. The sound was immense, a wall of noise that shook the floorboards. For their social circle, it was the greatest performance in history. For everyone else, it was fine. It was loud, it was energetic, and it was exactly what everyone expected. When they finished with a dramatic, crashing chord, the applause was deafening, a tidal wave of sound that washed over the stage. Blake took a bow, soaking it all in, his face triumphant. Leo watched from the shadows, his heart a steady, calm beat against the chaos. He saw the difference. Their performance was for others. It was a plea for approval, a shout for attention. What he was about to do wasn't for them. It was for himself. He had spent countless hours in his room with just a microphone and his loop pedal, building worlds out of sound. This wasn't about winning or being popular. It was about sharing a piece of his world, a piece he had carefully constructed. Brick by brick, beat by beat, after a few more forgettable acts, it was time. The principal walked back on stage, a warm smile on her face. "And now, for our final performer of the evening," she said, her voice echoing in the now quiet room. "Please welcome Leo." The name hung in the air like a question mark. A confused silence fell over the auditorium. You could hear a soft rustling of programs as people scanned the list of acts, their brows furrowed. "Leo?" a voice whispered from the front row. Another one answered, "I think he means that Leo." A few scattered giggles broke the silence like tiny raindrops before a storm. The confusion was palpable. Who was this kid? Why was he closing the show? From the side of the stage, Leo took a deep breath. He had one small pedal and the microphone. That was it. He walked out from behind the heavy curtain and into the blinding white light. The sudden warmth on his skin was a shock, and the crowd beyond the lights was just a dark, shapeless mass of faces. He felt incredibly small. He wasn't holding a guitar. He didn't have a prop. He was just a boy in a plain hoodie and jeans, walking toward the center of a huge stage. From the second row, Blake leaned back in his seat, a look of pure disbelief on his face. He turned to his friend, his voice a stage whisper that was deliberately loud enough for those around him to hear. "What's he gonna do? Tell us a bedtime story?" His friend snorted, and a few others chuckled. The comment was a spark, and it caught fire instantly. A wave of open, mocking laughter rippled through the auditorium. It wasn't just a few giggles anymore. It was a full-on chorus of amusement. It was the laugh of a crowd that felt tricked, that was expecting a big finale and was instead presented with this joke. Leo stood center stage, the microphone stand cold under his trembling fingers. The laughter was a physical force, pushing against him. It was loud and sharp and seemed to come from every direction at once. He could feel the heat rising in his cheeks. Hundreds of eyes were on him, most of them filled with ridicule. He saw the dark shapes of the audience pointing, their bodies shaking with mirth. He felt a knot of ice form in his stomach. For a terrifying second, it seemed like they were right. He was a fool. What was he thinking? He couldn't do this. He was just the quiet kid, the ghost. He should just turn around and walk away, disappear back into the wings and let the laughter be the end of his story. The sound washed over him, a wave of humiliation that threatened to pull him under completely. He stood frozen, a small, pale figure under the harsh spotlight, the target of the entire school's scorn. For a moment that stretched into an eternity, the laughter was the only thing that existed. It was a physical force, a hot, heavy wave that crashed over Leo, threatening to pull him under and drown him in a sea of humiliation. He stood frozen, his hand still clutching the cold metal of the microphone stand. The bright white lights felt like 1,000 interrogating lamps, exposing every flaw, every ounce of his fear. He could feel the sweat beading on his forehead, a cold, sticky proof of his panic. His mind was a screaming blank, a wall of pure white noise where a plan should have been. A voice, loud and insistent, screamed inside his head, "Run, just turn around and run. Get off the stage. It's not worth it." They were right. His feet felt like they were bolted to the wooden floorboards, but every instinct was telling him to break free and disappear back into the safety of the wings. The laughter continued, echoing in the vast space of the auditorium, each peal of mockery a tiny dagger. But then, another voice, a much quieter one, whispered from somewhere deep inside him. It was the same voice that had urged him to sign his name on that bright yellow sheet of paper. It was the voice that had kept him up for countless nights, not with worry, but with creation, with building beats and melodies in the quiet of his bedroom. "You didn't come here for them," the voice said. "You came here for this." And with that thought, something inside Leo shifted. It was like a switch being flipped. The screaming panic in his head didn't vanish, but it suddenly seemed farther away. Its shouts muffled and distant. Slowly, deliberately, Leo closed his eyes. The darkness was a blessing. It was a curtain he pulled down over the hostile world. The blinding lights, the mocking faces in the crowd, the vast, intimidating emptiness of the stage, it all disappeared. In the darkness, there was only him, the microphone in front of him, and the small, familiar pedal at his feet. He took a deep, slow breath, filling his lungs until his chest ached, and then let it out just as slowly. He focused on the feeling of the air moving in and out of his body. He focused on the steady, solid thump of his own heart. He was no longer on a stage in front of 1,000 people. In his mind, he was back in his small room, surrounded by posters of artists no one at school had ever heard of. The world outside his window shut out by the sound he was about to create. The laughter from the audience was still there, but it had changed. It was no longer a weapon aimed at him. It was just background noise, like the sound of a distant highway, meaningless and easy to ignore. He leaned forward, his lips just brushing against the cool mesh of the microphone. He was completely still for another second, a statue in the dark. Then he opened his mouth and made a sound. It wasn't a word or a note. It was a sharp, deep, punchy sound that came from his diaphragm. Boom! The sound shot through the speakers, clean and crisp, cutting through the fading laughter like a knife. It was a single, perfect kick drum, a sound with weight and presence that instantly commanded attention. The last few giggles in the auditorium died in people's throats. A sudden, confused silence fell over the crowd, without missing a beat. Leo tapped the small button on the pedal at his feet with the toe of his sneaker. Click. And then it happened. The sound repeated. Boom, and again. Boom, and again. Boom, boom, boom. A simple, steady, hypnotic rhythm began to pulse through the auditorium. It was a perfect loop, an electronic heartbeat that filled the space and seemed to make the very air vibrate. The audience was utterly still. People who had been leaning back in their seats, ready for a joke, were now leaning forward, their expressions blank with confusion. What was happening? This wasn't a poem. This wasn't a stand-up routine. This was something else entirely. From the second row, Blake's smirk had evaporated. He was staring at the stage, his head cocked to one side, a frown line etched between his brows. He looked at his friend, who just shrugged, his face a mirror of Blake's own bewilderment. This wasn't what they had expected. This wasn't funny anymore. It was just weird. And weird in the world of high school was a language they didn't speak. The rhythmic pulse from the speakers continued, a steady, confident foundation that seemed to dare anyone to laugh again. Leo, his eyes still closed, felt the rhythm flow through him. He was no longer nervous. He was in his element. He was a builder, and the kick drum was the concrete foundation of his creation. Now it was time for the walls. He leaned into the microphone again, this time producing a low, resonant hum from deep in his chest. It was a rich, buzzing sound, a perfect imitation of an electric bass. He let the note hang for a moment, then slid it up, creating a simple, melodic line that wound around the steady kick drum. He tapped the pedal again. Click. The bass line joined the drum beat, looping back on itself, intertwining with the rhythm to create something that was undeniably music. It was groovy, it was cool, and it was complex. And it was all coming from one quiet kid on a stage with nothing but his voice and a small box. The silence in the auditorium was now total. It was a different kind of silence. It wasn't the silence of waiting for a punchline or the silence of polite disinterest. It was the silence of absolute, rapt attention. You could have heard a pin drop. The rustling of programs had stopped. The fidgeting had ceased. Every single person in the room, from the teachers in the back to the little kids in the front, was staring at the stage, their faces illuminated by the ghostly light of the exit signs. They were all leaning forward, their minds trying to process what they were hearing. The quiet kid, the ghost, the object of their ridicule just moments before, was building an entire song right in front of them, using only his mouth. And it was good. It was really, really good. Leo stood in the center of his self-made world, a small, still figure orchestrating a symphony of sound, and for the first time all night the entire school was listening. The steady pulse of the kick drum and the deep groove of the bass line had transformed the auditorium. The air, which just moments ago had been thick with mockery, was now vibrating with a quiet, intense curiosity. Leo stood in the eye of this new storm, his eyes still closed, his body swaying almost imperceptibly to the rhythm he had created. He was no longer the scared boy frozen in the spotlight. He was an architect, and the foundation was laid. Now it was time to build the walls and the roof. With a smooth, practiced motion, he reached into the pocket of his jeans and pulled out a simple, black ballpoint pen. A few people in the audience tilted their heads, a new wave of confusion rippling through them. What was he going to do with a pen? Leo held it up to the microphone, his movements deliberate and sure. He clicked it. Click. The sound was sharp, clean, and cut through the music like a crack of lightning. He clicked it again, in perfect time with the beat. Click. He tapped his pedal, capturing the sound. Then he did it again, a little off-beat this time. Click-tap. He layered that too. Suddenly the simple beat had a complex, crisp snare drum. It was a sound so real, so textured, that people in the audience looked around for the hidden drummer. The song had a skeleton now, a solid, compelling structure that made you want to nod your head. The rhythm was no longer just a pulse. It was a heartbeat with a personality. From the second row, Blake watched, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. His face was a mask of concentration. He was a musician, or at least he played one in his band. He knew about beats and rhythm. He knew how hard it was to get a drum machine to sound this good, let alone a person's mouth and a clicking pen. He saw the precision in Leo's timing, the way each new sound fit perfectly into the existing loop without a single millisecond of error. This wasn't a trick. This was skill. Real, undeniable skill. The smirk on his face was long gone, replaced by a deep, unsettling frown. He was no longer watching a joke. He was watching a masterclass. And it was being given by the last person on earth he ever would have expected, but Leo was just getting started. He put the pen back in his pocket, his hands now free. He leaned into the microphone again, and this time he didn't make a percussive sound. He began to hum. It started as a low, simple melody, a line of golden thread that he carefully wove through the fabric of the drum and bass. It was a catchy, almost haunting tune that seemed to come from a place of deep feeling. He looped it, and the melody began to repeat, riding over the top of the rhythm like a bird soaring over a landscape. The song now had a soul. It was no longer just a collection of cool sounds. It was a piece of music with a beginning, a middle, and a direction. It was telling a story without using a single word. As the melody played, Leo's whole demeanor changed. The slight hunch in his shoulders disappeared. He stood up straighter. His head, once bowed, was now lifted slightly, a small, confident smile playing on his lips. He was no longer just a boy making noises into a microphone. He was a conductor, a composer, a performer. He began to move with the music, a subtle shift of his weight from one foot to the other, a gentle nod of his head in time with the snare drum. He was lost in his own creation, and the audience was lost with him. The dark, shapeless mass of faces beyond the lights was no longer a threat. They were with him, hanging on every note, every beat. You could feel a collective lean in the room, 1,000 bodies straining forward. Drawn into the world, Leo was building one sound at a time. Then he did something that seemed to defy logic. He leaned into the microphone and harmonized with his own melody. His voice, a clear and pure tenor, soared above the loop tune, creating a rich, chordal harmony that filled the entire auditorium. It was a sound so full and beautiful it felt like it was coming from a choir, not from one person. He held the note for a moment, his voice steady and strong, then he tapped the pedal. The harmony joined the symphony, a new layer of color and emotion. He did it again, this time with a higher harmony, a delicate, ethereal sound that floated above everything else. And then another. He was building a cathedral of sound with nothing but his voice. The song was now complete. It had a deep, driving rhythm. It had a soulful, memorable melody, and it had the lush, beautiful sound of a choir, all created by one boy standing on a stage with a microphone. The music was complex and layered, but it was also simple and emotional. It was happy and sad at the same time, a feeling that everyone in the room could understand, but no one could quite put into words. It was the sound of loneliness turning into connection, of a quiet voice finally finding a way to be heard. The entire auditorium was mesmerized. The teachers in the back row had forgotten to evaluate. The parents had forgotten they were there to watch their own kids. The students had forgotten about the social cliques and who was supposed to be cool and who wasn't. There was only the music. It filled every corner of the room, washing over everyone, creating a shared, powerful experience. In the front row, Blake and his friends were statues. Their faces, once filled with arrogant amusement, were now blank with utter disbelief. Blake, the king of the school social scene, the leader of the band that everyone cheered for, was staring at the quiet kid from the back of the class, and for the first time in his life, he felt completely and totally out of his depth. He was looking at someone who possessed a kind of power he couldn't even begin to understand, a power that had nothing to do with popularity or being loud. It was the power of pure, unadulterated talent, and it was absolutely breathtaking. Leo, with his eyes still closed and a look of pure peace on his face, had stolen the show, and he had done it without saying a single word. The symphony of sound that Leo had created, layer by layer, had reached its peak. The rhythm was a heartbeat, the bass was a pulse, the melody was a voice, and the harmonies were a soul. It was a complete, living thing that filled the vast auditorium. A world built from nothing but the quiet kid's imagination and voice. He stood in the center of it all, his eyes still closed, his body moving with a natural, easy rhythm that was a stark contrast to the rigid, terrified boy who had walked onto the stage just minutes before. He was no longer just performing. He was communicating. He was sharing a piece of himself that was so much bigger than words could ever contain. And then, as the song reached its most beautiful and complex point, he began to bring it home. He leaned into the microphone one last time and added a final, soaring harmony, a note so pure and full of emotion it seemed to pierce the very air. He held it, his voice steady and unwavering, a single, perfect sound that contained all the loneliness, all the hope, and all the quiet joy he had ever felt. The note hung in the air like a star, brilliant and breathtaking. Then, with a deliberate, gentle press of his foot on the pedal, he began to unravel his creation. The highest harmony faded first, dissolving into silence like smoke. Then the next one, leaving only the main melody and the rhythm beneath. The melody looped one last time, a sweet, sad farewell, before he tapped the pedal again, and it too vanished. All that was left was the deep, groovy bass line and the crisp beat of the kick and snare drum. He let them play on for a few more measures, a final, head-nodding groove that was the skeleton of the song he had built. Then he pressed the pedal one final time. The bass line faded and the drum beat slowed, each beat getting softer and softer until silence. It wasn't an awkward silence. It wasn't the silence of a bored audience waiting for the next thing. It was a sacred silence, a heavy, awe-filled void where the music had just been. For 3 full seconds, the entire auditorium was completely, utterly still. No one coughed. No one shifted in their seat. No one whispered. 1,000 people held their breath, their minds trying to catch up with what their ears had just experienced. The silence was so profound it was louder than the music had been. It was the sound of a collective jaw dropping. From the second row, Blake was frozen. His face, which had been a canvas of so many different emotions that night arrogance, amusement, confusion, concentration, was now a blank slate of pure, unadulterated shock. His mouth was slightly agape, his eyes wide as he stared at the still figure on stage. The cocky king of the school had been utterly dethroned, not by a rival or a fight, but by a quiet, overwhelming display of talent that was so far beyond his own comprehension it was in a different universe. He had spent his whole life building an identity based on being loud, being popular, being the center of attention. And in that moment he realized that true power wasn't about being the loudest person in the room. It was about having something to say that was worth listening to. And Leo, the quiet kid, had just said more in 2 minutes than Blake had in his entire high school career. Then the silence broke. It started with a single person, someone in the back row, who began to clap. It was a slow, deliberate clap at first, the kind of clap that says, "I have just witnessed something incredible." Then another person joined in. And another. Within seconds, a few scattered claps had turned into a wave, and the wave grew into a roar. It wasn't just applause. It was an explosion. The entire student body was on its feet, a deafening, thundering standing ovation that shook the very foundations of the auditorium. It was louder, more genuine, and more overwhelming than the applause for Blake's band, for the cheerleaders, for any other act that night. This was not the polite applause of obligation. It was the raw, emotional roar of a crowd that had been collectively blown away. Leo opened his eyes, as if surprised to find himself still on stage. The wall of sound hit him, a warm, overwhelming wave of approval. He saw the dark shapes of the audience on their feet, a sea of silhouettes clapping and cheering for him. For a moment he looked stunned, as if he couldn't quite believe it was real. Then a small, shy smile touched his lips. It wasn't a smirk of victory or a grin of arrogance. It was a quiet, humble smile of pure, unadulterated happiness. He gave a single, simple bow, not like a performer taking a bow, but like a person saying thank you. Then he turned and walked off the stage, disappearing back into the wings from which he had come. Leaving the roaring ovation to fill the space he had just commanded, the next Monday, the hallway was different. The river of noise and motion was still there, but the current had changed. Leo moved through it as he always did, but this time he wasn't a ghost. As he walked, heads didn't turn away from him. They turned toward him. The whispers that followed him were no longer filled with mockery or confusion, but with wonder. "That's him. That's the kid from the talent show. I still can't believe he did that with just his mouth." People who had never even looked at him before now smiled as he passed. A girl from his history class gave him a thumbs up. A guy he'd never spoken to stopped him by his locker. "Hey, man," he said, his voice full of genuine respect. "That was, incredible. Seriously, how did you do that?" Leo just shrugged, mumbled a quiet, "Thanks," and felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the crowded hallway. He saw Blake at his locker, surrounded by his usual crowd. For a split second, the old Leo would have tensed up, would have found another route to class. But the new Leo just kept walking. As he passed, Blake looked up, and their eyes met for the first time in what felt like forever. Blake's friends were laughing about something, but Blake wasn't paying attention. He just looked at Leo, and for a moment the confident mask was gone. There was no smirk, no arrogance, just a look of quiet acknowledgement. He gave Leo a slow, slight nod. It wasn't an invitation to sit at his lunch table. It wasn't an apology. It was something more. It was a sign of respect, a silent admission that the landscape had changed. Leo nodded back, just slightly, and continued on his way. He was still quiet. He still preferred his sketchbook and his headphones. He was still the same person he had always been on the inside. But on the outside, everything was different. He was no longer a piece of scenery, an anonymous figure in the background. He was the quiet kid who, for 2 incredible minutes, had built a world out of sound and stolen the show, proving to everyone that the loudest statements are sometimes made without a single word.